such a thrill for me to have you here. I mean, you are one of the greats of the greats.
Thanks for having me on. I'm so excited to be here.
So I know that we are going to get to Banks Rum and we're going to talk all about Banks Rum, but this couldn't be a Lush Life interview, especially with Jim Meehan, um, without asking you like how you got where you did. Now, I know you've been, on a bunch of podcasts that have your story. And what I'm really, really interested in is kind of the whys and the
hmm
hows, and um, kind of why you went from each place to each place and what you learned from those places. So instead of going chronologically about, and hearing your whole life story, more that what made you make the leap to the different parts of your life and making it where you feel that you were in a place to create something like Banks Rum. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, it does. Um,
Uh,
it reminds me of a similar question I had when I was in Chicago. I was doing an interview for it was like a Google, um, like a TED Talk, like Google chat, and I was on stage, and the sort of host, it felt very important. It was chats at Google, and the host asked me about like, well, what are you going to do next? Which I'm sure is the way that they speak when they're talking to like tech tech guys who are like going to start their next platform or whatnot. And the surprising answer to this question, perhaps maybe to that question, that I'll sort of reiterate or just sort of validate now is that what it's sort of an unglamorous answer, but when you're not independently wealthy, you don't decide what your next opportunity is. Your next opportunity is something that, in my case, it could come from a talk at at Tails, or it could come from a serendipitous bar, encounter, or it could come from an email from a publicist. And I feel like this may sound sort of strange, but in some ways, so many of the opportunities that I've taken advantage of in my life came from someone saying, "Hey, I'm working on this, and I could use, I'd love to talk to you about it." And it comes from taking the meeting. I mean, I guess the one bit of advice I would give to young bartenders, old bartenders, people who aren't bartenders or in another business is that, especially those of you out there who are not landed aristocrats, is that take the meeting. The worst that could happen is they're going to tell you about something that you're not going to want to do or not interested in. You can smile and nod and sort of listen to them and wish them the best. And it was maybe like a half an hour of your time. But I've taken a lot of meetings in my life. I've said no to 10 times as many things as I've said yes to. And I haven't said, "No, like, you're crazy. Why would you waste my time?" But I've just said, "Oh, you know what? That sounds great, but that's not me. Maybe this is a person who would be interested in this." So the short answer, without going through my whole life story, which is getting longer because I keep getting older, is that I took the meeting, I listened, and some of these things were very interesting to me, and I got involved.
of course, of course. Now, of course, I've just skipped so much ahead, but there has been an intro, so I have introduced you in the pre-part of this podcast. But why don't you, in your own words, just say a little bit about who you are and what we're here to discuss?
Yeah. So today in 2022, I'm Jim Meehan. I am a longtime bartender who is now the beverage director of a restaurant and outdoor lifestyle brand called Snow Peak. It's a third generation Japanese company. I'm the beverage director of the U.S. branch of that here in Portland, Oregon. Before I was in Portland, I was a longtime resident of New York City, where I had the great fortune of opening a bar called PDT, after opening a bar with Audrey Saunders called the Pegu Club, after working at illustrious restaurants like Gramercy Tavern. In addition to being in the restaurant and bar business for my whole adult life, I've written two books, the PDT Cocktail Book and my eponymous Bartender's Manual, and helped most famously launch a few different entrepreneurial sort of projects that are cocktail culture centric. apps, bar bags, roll ups, spoons, spice blends, but most importantly, and why I'm here today, Banks Rums, a blended rum. We have two of them, a white from 5 origins, a gold from 7. We That was launched 10 years ago, and I still remain uh, an ongoing sort of ambassador and advisor to the.
All right, we'll talk about banks, which are sitting behind me, and of course, your book too is sitting behind me. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, they can see those. So I guess from what I asked before to now, I guess what I was thinking is the from each step. You say you fell into everything from taking that call, but what do you think? And I guess this is kind of looking at your life story in a different way. What do you think you took from those moments, and we'll kind of break them down that that those that took you on to the next thing, and um, I guess kind of how you grew to do the next thing better. So maybe start off with the time before you came to New York and kind of what you took from that time when you were in Chicago and Wisconsin and you know made you, I guess, seek kind of like go up the ladder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would
Sorry.
say
I know I'm
that
not being very erudite about this. I guess it's
no,
trying to
I mean,
look
I
at it
think
like
that these
each
are good.
step
These
along
are
the
good
way.
questions. Yeah, from the time I was in third grade, because I remember a book I made in third grade that was about my life and future. Wanted to be a doctor. I went to college at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they didn't have a pre med. You couldn't get into a. They didn't have a pre med program, so you took the pre med track, and then you took the M. And I struggled. I also, growing up, had a great English teacher in seventh grade named Mr. Samuelson, who taught his seventh graders like Goodwill Hunting. And I fell in love with literature in seventh grade. So third grade, I knew I wanted to be a doctor for the rest of my life. Seventh grade, I knew I loved literature. And so I went to college and I was taking literature classes for half my time and then doing the pre-med track. I was loving literature and I was getting pummeled in math and science. Come my sophomore year, I'm volunteering at the UW hospital in the ER, helping the nurses, in these trauma situations. And I'm working at a bar at night. And to make a long story short, um, it became clear to me that I was not going to get is a high MCAT score and get into medical school. And I needed to rethink this medical school thing. I knew from working in the hospital that I liked that work, but I just knew that I wasn't going. It was the way that the educational system is set up in America. Like, you got to get very high scores to get into med school. I was struggling with maths and chemistry. And was thinking about it. My mom was a school teacher, Catholic school teacher growing. My dad worked at a racetrack, and my mom loved her job. She did half as much as I did as a 20-year-old bartender in Wisconsin. And my dad hated his job. And thought about how so many of the people who came to my bar, regardless of whether they were like teachers or lawyers or politicians or whatever they did, they seemed to kind of like sulk into the bar, and then I'd give them some drinks and then they'd like perk up. And I realized that they were happiest not when they were at work, but they were happiest when they were with me at the bar. I really liked working at the bar a lot. And this idea hit me as a young person that instead of like doing a job for the prestige, or instead of doing a job for the money, or instead of doing a job because it was like what I thought I was supposed to do, what if I did a job that I really liked, like the one I was doing? And so I decided as a very young person that I should continue working as a bartender, working in the. And it was a very unusual decision, and this was in 1998, to go to college, graduate with good marks, and work in the restaurant business. But that is the decision that I made. And I think it was a good decision because I've spent the last, this is the hardest 2 years of my restaurant life, opening this restaurant during a pandemic and reckoning in the industry in which systemic inequities and abuse was always talked about in the restaurant business in the last 2 years. And I think that it's it's great that I love what I do because it's been a hard 2 years. And I think that I'm blessed that while work is hard right now and it's never been easy, I love my work. And so I think that's made, as far as like what happened in Wisconsin, I decided to do something I loved for my career, and it's really great as far as in the beginning when I was doing a job that a lot of people didn't even want to be doing. And so I excelled at it. It was easy in my early years to sort of move up the ladder because no one wanted to be on the ladder. And ironically, no one wants to be on the ladder right now again either. So I'm at the top of the ladder, so I can't move up really any further. But we are now back to where I was back 20 plus years ago, where like people don't think the restaurant business is cool. And fortunately I do. So I don't struggle with motivation to go to work. I just now have to motivate a whole new generation to think what I've always loved is cool.
Yeah, yeah. It is tragic that no one really wants to that there are so many spots are needed, so many places, are open for people in the hospitality industry, and they're just not coming to it right now. But so I guess the answer to that question was love. Okay, so the
Yeah.
love was at the beginning. Now, you were loving what you were doing in the Midwest. Why did you feel that it was necessary to come to New York City?
I was working in a college town, which Madison, for those of you who probably don't know it as well, is the state capital of Wisconsin. It has the university, which has 40 some thousand students. And so a lot of people think, oh, Wisconsin, that's just like a farm. A lot of people, if you live in New York, it's funny. There are a lot of Americans who think that New York is New York, Miami, and Los Angeles, and all the space in between that you like fly over to get to those places. But for those of us who come from one of the places you fly over, the Midwest is not just farms, and Wisconsin isn't either. And so it is actually a very cosmopolitan place. But the challenge I had is because it's a university town. There's a lot of transients. People come there for school and then they move on. And so I found myself 7 years in, at the very top of that food chain, and realizing that I thought I was good and I wanted to go to a place to find out what the ceiling was. And I also was the, like it's the old Matthew McConaughey, like I stay the same age, or, I keep getting older and everyone stays the same age. Like all of my friends and colleagues were continuously college age. So at a certain point, you
Of
age out a
course.
little bit. It's sort of like, hey, I'd like to work with people in my own age group, and I'd actually like to get mentored. And I've been reading about Dale DeGroff, who had just published his The Craft of the Cocktail, and I've been reading about his protege Audrey Saunders, and I was thinking like, wow, what if I could meet someone like that and get under his wing? So I moved to New York in the hopes of seeing if I was any good, and B, seeing if I could find someone to mentor me to make me better.
Which you did, and, you ended up at the
Yeah, and I
Pegu
did.
Club. Now, you absolutely were
I think that
successful
that
in
was
that.
like
Now
a yeah, that was a lesson for New York, is that when I had a plan when I moved to New York, and
uh
I followed the plan. I think that when you go to a place that is like New York or London, um, they're very competitive, there's scarce resources, like going back to the not independently wealthy. So you got to figure out what you're going to do. You got to work hard, and ideally you have a plan, because it's going to be, you got to be focused.
yes, yes, of course, and that definitely you were, and also being at the kind of the right time of all these things happening. There was a lot of great stuff, kind of the revolution, if you want to call it, or the Renaissance, whatever. With it, I lived in New York until 2003, so I was right. I just had moved to London a little bit before this cocktail revolution in London. There was Temple Bar, there was Angel Share and Milk and Honey,
Yeah.
which I had been to. But then it kind of just exploded. Now, kind of fast forwarding a little again to the how and why is, you're at the Pegu Club, you're doing your thing. When did you think it was the right time to open your own place?
Well, ironically, I ended up being the last opening bartender at the Pegu Club, of the opening team. I stayed there for 2.5 years. And the time that I knew it was getting ripe was, I had so I explained to a lot of people about the Pegu Club. The as you mentioned, the first 3 bars, Temple Bar, Angel Share, and Milk and Honey. And then from there, you have the Flatiron Lounge, and then you have Employees Only, and then Little Branch. So these are the like 5 cocktail bars in New York City, of which Angel Share is mostly serving Japanese clientele. Temple Bar is not quite, they're not the 2.0. They're still the best version of 1.0. So there's
Yeah.
just very few serious cocktail bars that are sort of doing what Milk and Honey was doing or what Pegu or Flatiron were doing. And so at first, a lot of my friends would come and visit me and they'd be like, "What are you doing here?" Like, it wasn't the only people drinking there were the like Daily Candy, like sort of jet set
Oh,
of
of
like young
course.
professional women and the New York media. That was who drank at the Pegu Club. And otherwise, it was dead. We made no money. I made $80 a night. Mm. It was busy on the weekends for this bridge and tunnel crowd that I thankfully didn't experience, but it took a long time for like, basically, when we opened it, cocktails were not cool, and by the time it closed, cocktails were an institution and were the most cool thing on earth, and so in the
Yeah,
early days
absolutely.
yeah, in the early
Yeah,
days, people used to come what the between the Daily Candy and New York media, there were sort of people were kind of thinking it was cool, and so there were consulting opportunities, offered or sort of hinted at or like cards dropped almost every week, of like, "Hey, I'm working on a restaurant, I'd love to hear what you think," or whatever. So one of those um latter day consulting opportunities was my coworker at Pegu Club, Sinjin Frizzell, who obviously has gone on and opened a bunch of bars and restaurants in Brooklyn since. He was working at the Good Fork in Red Hook and had a guest come to his bar and ask for me, and he overheard them talking, and he sort of like interjected and said, "Hey, are you talking about Jim Meehan? I work with him at the Pegu Club." And so this gentleman came to the Pegu Club when Sinjin and I were working and told me that he and his like high school or childhood friend were opening a bar in the East Village, and they wonder if I'd be interested in checking it out. And that was Brian Shabaro, who owned Criff Dogs, and Chris Antista, who helped him open it originally and then got off the project and was helping him open PDT essentially. And the two of them were in the process of building out what is now PDT in a former bubble tea lounge, which so I visited when it was sort of an early construction site and talked to them. And they had an idea in mind, the phone booth and the sort of hidden bar um, attached to the hot dog stand was in place, but no idea how to run a bar or what to serve in it. So that was when the conversations began, and I got along really well. Chris was a regular of mine at 5 Points, which was the first restaurant I worked at when I moved to New York City. So I knew him well, and I got along really well with Brian, and then that was off to the races.
and, when you finally had, I guess, I'm sorry, I don't know if you were creating the menus at Pegu Club, but when you got your first chance to have your own menu, was it overwhelming, or did you already know, "Oh my
No,
god, I've been
so
dream" is this kind of like your Oscar speech? Like, I know what I'm gonna say. I've been dreaming about this for years."
so in 2000, I arrived in New York in 2002, and from 2002 to 2000, so like it was almost 2 years. I think I was at 5 Points. We had this $5 martini, dollar oyster happy hour that was huge, and then we served. Basically, this was like the end of the fruit martini phase. So I served a
Uh-huh.
lot of like apple martinis and regular vodka martinis and sort of those are the drinks there, and then we served a lot of new, like, really kind of dynamic American wines. We had the Robert Chatterton portfolio there. The wine list was great. So At 5 Points, that was when I sort of was almost going to go the way of wine, where I went to, like you said, Milk and Honey in 2003 for the first time. And I lived across the street from WD-50 and met Eben Freeman and sort of, so I experienced Eben's cocktails at WD-50. And then I went to obviously Employees Only, and Schiller's was around the corner from where I live, which was
Yeah.
Keith McNally's
Of
spot.
course, the restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah, that was before Employees, or right around the time Employees Only opened. That was the project that Duchan and did before Employees Only. So I was sort of in this sort of, I was almost going to be a sommelier, and then I started trying these cocktails, and Vintage and Forgotten Cocktails came out. And at a certain point, I knew that 5 Points was never going to let me write a list. So Jimmy Bradley and Danny Abrams hired me to open their Italian restaurant Pace in Tribeca. And I told them that in order to leave 5 Points, I would need them to make me the bar manager and make me a sommelier. And I remember Danny looking at me, he's like, that position doesn't exist. And I was like, well, you're going to need to create it. And they did. So I worked 3 nights on the floor as a sommelier in a restaurant right around the corner from the financial district, selling 150 bottle all Italian list to bankers. And then 2 nights a week, I worked behind the bar, and I had my own bar program. And that was the first time I worked with a great PR company, and they had me, I was in the New York Times that year. And I also, Andrew Knowlton named my Montenegro Manhattan, which was a Maker's Mark Manhattan with Montenegro Amaro, his cocktail of the year in Bon Appetit. And so it was like a watershed year for me. You know, for all you young bartenders out there, I was putting Amaro in my Manhattan in 2003. It was, a watershed moment for me. And then from there, that was sort of how I lured Audrey Saunders into my bar. And then once I met Audrey Saunders, I put the full court press on her to hire me at the club. So they just, I went to Bevelman's and met her, and then had a meeting with her across the street at the Brandy Library, and just basically all but begged her to hire me to 10 bar.
So you were kind of an old hat by the time not old as an old, but you
It was like a
your way
new
around
hat.
It was a new hat,
It was
not
a
an
new
old
hat, but it was going well.
Okay, it was going well. So you were well sorted for PDT. It wasn't like you were like, I got this. I know exactly what I want. I know what I'm doing.
The other thing that happened was Pega Club had a long delay on opening. And so Pace was sort of, even though it was this very cool restaurant, we didn't get a good New York Times review. And Jimmy Bradley and Danny Abrams were breaking up their partnership, and it was kind of going down in flames. And a coworker of mine, who was a previous Gramercy Tavern employee, was like, hey, my sister still works at Gramercy Tavern. I worked there for a long time. They're hiring a bartender right now, which they haven't done in years and years and years. I think you'd be perfect for this job. So he suggested I go interview. So I went and interviewed at Gramercy Tavern, and I went from bar manager, assistant wine director, management in the magazines to like, hey, can I be a bartender at Gramercy Tavern? So very much not a lateral move, in many ways a move down. But what everyone told me was like, hey, like, if you're serious and you want to work in a great place, and you want to work at a place that is culturally wired like you'll fit in here. And I went in and I interviewed and got hired. So I was the first bartender that Gramercy had hired in many years that wasn't from the floor. And I started there, and it was right at a time when Tom Colicchio was selling to Danny Meyer, and Mike Anthony was brought in as the new chef, and they were going to sort of like do Tom's very successful menu into Michael's, Stone Barns. And so I was working with these very senior bartenders at Gramercy Tavern while I was waiting for Pegu Club to open. And one by one, all these dinosaurs, who I know you guys aren't that old, but all these bartenders who'd been there forever all left. And within 9 months, I was writing the menu at the Gramercy Tavern. So obviously there were a number of classics which came back on. I didn't create all the cocktails, But for my 2 years, for at least the last year and a half of my time at Gramercy, I was in charge of the cocktail menu there. So the cool thing for me about working at Pegu was I only worked there once a week, and I was working with like Toby Maloney and Brian Miller and Phil Ward and Sam Ross and Kent and all these guys, Alistair Burgess, been there, and they were working full time. So this will surprise some people. I think, 2 drinks on the menu at the Pegu Club in 2.5 years. Like only two of my drinks, maybe, yeah, two, the 21st century and the improved, I think it was called the improved, a Norwegian old fashioned or something. But in my time there, I'd only put 2 drinks on the menu, but I was writing the list at Gramercy. So I didn't feel like I was creatively limited.
No, no, not at all. Actually hadn't realized that. I thought it was gradual. I didn't think that it was all you were doing it all at once. All at once. That is
For
like
2.5 years, I was working
mind-blowing.
full time at Gramercy, which was 50 hours. I was working 1 shift a week at Pegu, which was about a 10 or 11-hour shift. And I was editing the Food and Wine Cocktail Book with Kate Crater by myself. So that was a job. Some weeks was 15 or 20 hours a week. And I had to go to Midtown to recipe test all the drinks, in the Food and Wine test kitchen. So for these 2 or 3 years, I did that for 6 years, I think. For at least that 6-year period, I was working 90 hours.
Well, that answers the question of what you brought to PDT, because you brought like everything. Management, cocktail creation, running a place, writing, everything to now what was then your, kind of I was thinking of it as your baby kind of PDT. You had already
It
had many
was,
children by then.
I was, yeah, it was, I guess the best way to describe it is that, um, working at Gramercy Tavern will always be associated with Danny Meyer, now with Mike Anthony, then with Tom Colicchio. So I work for Danny, or I work for that Square
Mhm.
Hospitality Group, or at the Pegu Club, it'll always be remembered and correctly as Audrey's Bar. And
Of
so
course.
these other places I worked at were someone else's place, whereas PDT was, up until I'm not involved anymore, was irrevocably, and maybe even still, like, people think of me when they think of PDT. And I think that was the biggest difference, is going from sort of like being a creative mind as a part of a
Mhm.
stable, to being kind of credited as, proprietor.
And how did that feel?
I also think that, a lot of what, the jump to Banks Rums, like the time, this is all beginning to get to Banks. And I think that Pegu Club, in addition to opportunities for consulting, there were opportunities for brand work, as like Charlotte Boise and Simon Ford, and a whole sort of like slowly a trickle of a lot of British bartenders kind of coming over to New York and America. And like Simon and Charlotte, to me, and Jacob Briers were really the three that were like the prototypical new people who were like arguably the marketing and sales, geniuses of their time. And I feel like they were coming over, and they were around my age, young and less experienced than they are now. And then we were getting a lot of focus group work at the time, where it's, okay, come in for an hour to, an office in Midtown and tell us what you think. And here's like $500. And I think for me, after doing a lot of these focus groups, there was part of what happened with Banks was the tell that it could have gone that way, where it's, hey, let's just get some of your ideas. And my instinct was like, you know what, I've been doing enough of these focus groups and meeting with founders. This idea for Banks came about, where I was like, you know what, I want to actually not only give you guys advice, but I want to stick around and find out if any of it works. I actually want to
And
think so much of what people probably think about either my career or their careers. um, People probably think being successful is having success. And I would argue that yes, obviously it's not incorrect, but I've learned the most and grown the most through my failures or through my shortcomings or through the things that haven't worked. And I kind of intrinsically even knew back that in order to actually grow from these focus group and sort of paid opportunities, that I needed to get into a driver's seat where I could actually see if we were getting it.
And what timing wise, when did Banks come into your life? What were you doing then?
So I was by Banks's time, I think it was a year into PDTs. PDT made a huge splash in New York City, and the easiest way to describe it was that Sasha Petrovsky, who was really, was highly inspired by Angel Share, everyone kind of knew that what Sasha and Milk and Honey were doing was revolutionary, but Sasha refused to talk to the media. He had this very sort of artistic streak, and he wouldn't take interviews for the most part. I mean, Robert Simonson cracked that towards the end of his short life and was able to get him on the record for his book and for some articles. But for the most part, Sasha didn't speak for his own work. And in the absence of Sasha speaking for his own work, PDT was like the hidden speakeasy style bar in New York City that was similar enough to Milk and Honey, where people wanted to talk about this as a trend. Sasha wouldn't speak to them, so I did. And so I ended up getting just giant, amount of press for PDT because, like you said earlier, right place, right time, right concept, and willing to talk about it. And so a year into PDT, the place is going pretty well. I get hired to do
let me interrupt
catering
you. Let me interrupt you. Also, you have to add to that great cocktails because PDT could have been all of those things, but if the drinks hadn't been good, no one would have come back. So, kudos to you.
Yeah, I mean, the team was executing, at a very high level. I was surrounded. I ended up, it's kind of a fun story. When PDT opened, we opened 5 months after Death and Company opened. And when Death and Company opened, Phil Ward and Brian Miller and Jim Kearns, who were 3 of my bartender buddies, Pegu Club, all left the Pegu Club to open Death and Co. And it left a huge hole in the bar schedule at Pegu Club and a huge hole in Audrey's heart, which I was there to sort of console her about. And there was also, we were still at a period in New York where there weren't a lot of cocktail bartenders. So I opened PDT with 2 of my regulars from the Pegu Club, they were bar regulars, John Darragon and Don Lee. And then I staffed it with a bunch of folks who couldn't get enough shifts, the 5 other cocktail bars. And so we were sort of it was a castaway crew sort of that we opened with, and just everyone really, John and Don ended up recruiting former Columbia grads that they had gone to college with or were working with. At one point, I had 5 Columbia grads on the staff at PDT. It was right during the financial crash of 2000. The bar opened in 2007. The financial crash happens in 2008. And as I think about it now, as horrendous as that time was for so many Americans, it was a watershed period in hospitality where the combination of these, heroic figures like Bourdain and the rise of the Food Network really pushed a lot of people who were very highly educated, highly gifted and talented people into hospitality because they thought it was cool and desk job that they thought they were going to get wasn't going to work out. And so we really had a great team for good reasons and bad, and they were doing great. So we fast forward to Banks. I got hired to do PDT got hired to cater art gallery opening in Tribeca by a cognac company, by a small company called Hine. And I went down with a couple coworkers and made drinks at this small gallery. And I liked one of the drinks. It was a variation on Sam Ross's Kentucky Made, which was a bourbon. And I made it with cognac instead of bourbon. And I made it with lime instead of lemon. And I made it with cucumbers and mint because the Queen's Park Swizzle and the Pim's Cup were very popular at the time. And I added falernum because I like the spice with the cognac. And it sold well. It was well received at the gallery. I put it on the menu at the bar. And then a month later, this guy who hired me for this gig comes into the bar and he's like, and he was, his name was John Peloton. He's still a good friend. I just had dinner with him in New York last time I was there. And he's like, he grew up in Long Island from a sort of wealthy family, worked in the liquor business at Moët Hennessy his whole life. He was a very sort of like blue-blooded, but very nice, intelligent, engaging man who was in his 60s at this time. And he, came to the bar and not being arrogant, but he's like, "What are you doing with my cognac? Like you guys are going through 2 cases a week. You're the biggest account in the country, and there's all these sales in the neighborhood. Like he's like, what is your little, basement dive bar in the East Village doing with my fancy cognac brand?" And I was like, well, the drink that I created for your party, I liked it. I put it on my menu. All the bartenders in the neighborhood drink here, and that's what happens here. And so it was a light bulb moment for him where I think he realized that, like, oh, someone like me could be someone who could incubate and accelerate a brand. And so fast forward a couple months, he told me that he was working on a rum project. He'd like me to meet his partners, and I flew down to Florida with him, and then I flew to London with him. And when I was at Design Bridge in London with the whole team established, I spent 2 days in these like focus group type meetings. And after meeting the partners, I always say that it felt like Ocean's 11. It was like a group of like celebrity sort of like high IQ, it felt like a bunch of kind of guys getting together for like one last heist. They were all in their like late 60s. They'd all built big brands. They were all quite wealthy, but they were all kind of pooling their resources to do it one more time. For some of them can't stop themselves. But I was the youngest person in the room by 25 years, and it was just it was intoxicating to. But I was also running the #1 bar in the world, and I was sort of like this young person with these older gentlemen who had been doing it their whole career, who were like,
Right.
My parents' age. And I was saying a lot of things, and they were listening to me. And it was intoxicating to be around these entrepreneurs who had done it, had succeeded, were successful, but were listening to me, and I was helping to create the brand. And so after a few productive meetings, I said, hey, would you guys be interested, instead of paying me for this, offering me potentially some shares and letting me be part of this journey? And they agreed. So I worked with them for a year, and then we launched Banks 5 in 2010.
Okay, a little bit about Banks's history. Kind of where did you come in the project? Was there already liquid in a bottle? What did they want your brain for? The making of it, and also your relationship with rum.
Yeah, so you're beginning to probably pick up a pattern here 40 minutes into our talk, that I, in the same way that I kind of fell involved with PDT, these guys had a plan. They all sat down and planned to launch a rum brand, and they one of the former chairman, Arnaud de Tribuc, had long time work for Angostura, and he had sort of found a firm in Amsterdam called Sheer, which has been blending rums for 300 years, and had worked with them to develop a formula for a white rum. And then John Peloton, this gentleman who I did the catering gig, brought me lab samples of some final blends that they were considering. I picked my favorite one of those, which ended up being the final blend, and did what I call the Pepsi challenge with every kind of spirit. If it's a white rum, I'm going to try it on its own, try it next to the other white rums I have, and then use it in cocktails. So I made a daiquiri with it with fresh lime and sugar. I made a mojito and I made a rum and coke. And lo and behold, I found a sort of rum that was flavorful enough to shine through even Coca-Cola and was, you know, really made a beautiful daiquiri and as well as mojito. And that was when I sort of knew that I wanted to be involved in this project. And for me, I'd seen vodka had been ascendant my whole career. Gin was on the move thanks to these British brand ambassadors like Simon Ford and Charlotte Voisey. Tequila was just beginning its ascendance with Phil Ward and Mai Well and the Oaxaca Old Fashioned. Bourbon was ascendant, rye was coming, cognac and scotch were already huge. And I really liked rum and found that rum had the most opportunity in front of it. And I found that, you know, that rum was a great category, but it suffered from a few different challenges in 2010. One was that it was kind of viewed by a lot of the industry as a commodity, where there was like a sort of pride in how cheap the rums you used were in your drinks. And so price was something, downward price was something that really drove popularity, not upward price. And then I also felt that, you know, having tried certain styles of rum that like Jamaican rum or rum from Guyana or rums from Martinique and Guadeloupe and Reunion that were dry rums, that a lot of people associated rum because it was made from sugarcane as something sweet. And so a lot of consumers especially didn't understand that like great rum was as sophisticated and complex as cognac or whiskey. And so I as a sort of like person who made drinks, but also was a sort of spirits, you know, enthusiast and educator, knew that this rum that I had just tasted really had legs because it was dry. There was no sugar added. It was really rich and flavorful, and it made great drinks. And I felt like the white rum sort of dilemma. White rum has the most kind of classic cocktails to mix with it of all of them. And so I was really excited about it. And that's what kind of hooked me. The quality of this rum really kind of got me involved. So to answer your question directly, Banks existed. It was the first rum was going to be a white rum. I got involved at the final end of the selection of the formula for the Banks 5. And then I helped them in sort of all the communications and creating any visual or written content in the beginning. And then I kind of gave them the idea of attaching 5 to Banks 5 because I felt that for bartenders, remembering Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and Java or Indonesia would be a challenge, so that this would be like a sort of a mnemonic device to help them remember, oh, it's a rum from 5 origins.
Now, saying that, I'm glad you brought that up because, hold on, the 5, but just a little backstory. The 5, why did they choose those places?
So the process for the selection the way that Share works. You sort of give them a brief of like what you're going for, and then they provide samples. And so the process of creating 5 and 7 wasn't. You can go to them and say, hey, like I want to, you know, create my own independent label of rum, and I want it to be rums from Martinique, and they can source that way. But there's other ways of doing this where you can sort of go to them with other needs or wants, and then they send you rums that they think would fulfill that. So with Banks 5 and Banks 7, the idea was to create a dry, flavorful rum that would mix well with cocktails. I always like to sort of mention that Arnaud, our chairman who worked directly with them, was a big cigar smoker, and he wanted something I think he could smoke cigars with as well. So what our original idea was something that was good on its own as well as great in cocktails. And I was there to make sure that they were great in cocktails.
Now,
so to answer your question, it had 5 rums in it it has 20 rums in it actually, but it has 20 rums from 5 origins to fulfill the brief. And I think it's this sort of strange thing to in our single origin craft distilled world to imagine this, but this generation of entrepreneurs I was working with grew up in a world in which Champagne, which is a blend of wines, Bordeaux, which is a blend of wines from multiple origins, blended Scotch whiskey, which is a blend of whiskeys from multiple distilleries, cognac, which is a blend of brandies from multiple distilleries. All of the sort of prestigious, super premium wines and spirits of the 70s, 80s, even 90s were not single origin, single batch, single distiller products. They were blends crafted from longtime master blenders. And so I think in their mind, quality and super premium, sort of quality products were not the sort of product of terroir or not the product of a genius distiller. They were the sort of the byproduct of a blend of many different things from someone who was more of a blender than a distiller.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm seeing, a lot of other brands, some whiskeys are starting to create blends again. I think that that single malt or single idea, not it's reached its pinnacle, but we all appreciate that. But now it's kind of going back to appreciating the mastery of blending, which is such an art and might be even more difficult than, just having one thing. So was there only the white when you were involved, or were they also?
Yeah, so we launched with the white rum.
Yeah.
Launched with white. We won Best New Product at Tales of the Cocktail. I think it was in 2011 with Banks 5 Island, and went back to Sheer in 2012, I believe, to work on Banks 7. And that was when I got to be involved for the whole thing. And then I did that with Arno. And then there were a couple of super exceptional rums that we tried during a couple sessions there that went into a decanter bottling called Endeavor, and that sold out and is gone. But Banks 7 was something I got to be involved with the entire process. And it was a lot of fun. It was essentially the same thing. We came up with like a brief of what we were looking for. And I wanted something that I could mix an old fashioned with, or a Queen's Park Swizzle. We knew that the flavor of Banks 5 was sort of that we, had struck a nerve in the industry, but we wanted to bring some of Banks 7 is what I would call gold rum versus an aged rum. It's and the gold rum style, the sort of penultimate examples of it are in the West Indies. So we sort of were looking for some of that like rich West Indian sort of like chocolatey richness. And what ended up happening was Arno and I tasted through dozens and dozens of rums, and we narrowed down on 5. And funny enough, our Karsten, our master blender, told us that the 5 that we liked most all had Batavia Rack in it. And the one that we selected to be Banks 7 had all 5 of the original, had rums from all 5 of the original origins. So Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and the Batavia Rack. And that Panama and Guatemala there were rums from Panama and Guatemala in that the blend we liked the most in there as well. So that was when we decided, if it's going to be from 7 origins, we should call it Banks 7. And then we were sort of off to the races.
Now, for those who might not know, and I really don't know what it is, what is Batavia Rack?
So Batavia Rack is a style of, rum is sort of the Batavia Rack in Banks 7 and 5 is rum. Batavia Rack, though, is a spirit. Arak is sort of a generic term for spirit in that part of the world, and it's essentially the Batavia Rack can be made from molasses, but it can also be made from other sort of fermentable sugars. So it can be made from palm or coconut sugar as well. So part of the original challenge of both launching back then and even to this day now is the
there's not a lot of there's no sort of Bible of Batavia Rack that is like the David Wondrich like sort of book that explains everything that the history of Batavia Rack and every different distillery. You know, there's no Michael Jackson's Distilleries of Indonesia book. It's a sort of it's a product from a place in the world that is not super open to the West, and Cheer has been sourcing Batavia Rack for a very long time, hundreds of years from them. What makes it unique and sort of stand apart is a lot of rums from Java use a sort of koji starter. Like there's a little bit of like a rice starter that catalyzes fermentation. So the rum that we get from there, we call it our spice, and it's it has this sort of salt-like capacity to integrate all of the different rums that are in our blends, as well as accentuate some of their best characteristics. So it's almost like salt on a steak or Angostura bitters in a Manhattan. It spices things up. When you taste a bottle of Batavia Rack, like if you can find one and give it a taste, it doesn't taste like Banks. And there's probably 6 or 7% of the blend is Batavia Rack. It's not a huge percentage, but in my opinion, it is what makes Banks. It distinguishes Banks from all other blended rums, and we were the first to use it in a blend, in a West Indian rum blend.
It sounds so interesting. I can't wait to try it by itself if I can ever find Batavia Rack. So did it work in your old fashions and the drinks that you wanted it to? Was it?
It did.
Were you
I mean, I think that
this is it.
Yeah, my Pepsi challenge for Banks 7 was the old fashioned. It was a drink that was really, becoming popular around 2013 when we first launched it. And I made a Queen's Park Swizzle with it. It was also right around this time that I really started pushing for punch to be our drink strategy. David Wondrich had written his follow-up to his book Imbibe, Punch, and I really felt that following the success of his biography of Jerry Thomas Imbibe, that this big, beautiful book Punch he wrote was going to be widely adopted by the trade and would make sense to consumers who, for those of the people who spent the pandemic making cocktails instead of sourdough, Punch it's great because you can spend all day making a bowl of punch and then you actually get to enjoy it with your party as opposed to being stuck making cocktails all night like Bartender. So it was around this time that I worked with Jacob Briers on a punch set that we used to launch Banks, that we basically used once Bacardi acquired Banks a few years later. But this was a time where I realized that Banks 5 worked really well in a signature drink that I created called the Green Tea Punch that had mint and sencha and lime and sugar and nutmeg. And with Banks 7, I created a drink with, I really like teas. And so I started working, for those of you in London, with Henrietta Lovell at Rare Tea. And she and I have done a bunch of cool work. But there's a drink that she and I came up with for a series of events we did at Tales of the Cocktail called the R&R that had her rooibos, which she gets a single estate rooibos from South Africa with some maple syrup and some lemon and Banks 7 and nutmeg, and it's outstanding.
It's funny. I was going to bring up punch because I had read that you had been talking about punch lately, and that that these were working really well, and that was your idea for punch. So I'm really glad you brought it up. Now, when I think punch, and as some other listeners might, well, I don't think punch because I've read David Wondrich's book, so I know a little bit about punch. But when, the common person thinks about punch, you think about, this going to an event and there's a huge bowl and someone has poured, it's like the Long Island iced tea of drinks. They've just poured every single thing into it. And that is punch. When you talk punch, what do you mean by punch?
So that's a great introduction. So it's funny when Banks 5 launched and I went out to try to get people to understand what we were doing, I would go to bars and I would order a daiquiri, and the bartender would like sheepishly frown and be like, "I'm so sorry, but we don't have a blender," or "I'm so sorry, but we don't have any strawberries." They didn't understand that I wanted a handshaken daiquiri with just lime and sugar. And it's the same thing with punch. You assume like when you create a drink strategy or when you sort of are like, "Oh, this is a perfect rum for punch, that this is gonna work." And then like you said, punch, to me, like from David Wondrich's mouth, is sort of this ambrosial liquid that was, formulated for, before cocktails, that was very much ascendant and fashionable before. And it was originally created by sailors who'd run out of their beer and wine. And it was typically a blend of a strong spirit, which would have been rum on these ships, sometimes maybe cognac, that was mixed with citrus, which they would have been taking for scurvy, with sugar to balance that citrus, and then lengthened with probably tea or water or wine, and then served with the spice. So it was something that was sort of perfected in punch clubs in London, but served all over the world. And it is low proof, sessionable, but interesting. And it's sort of, if you serve it on a big block of ice, the ice dilutes, and sort of, so it becomes more and more like mellow and sessionable as you sit with it. In the old days, someone might have sat with a bunch of friends and sipped it like bottle service, I guess, in the 1800s. It's the 1800s form of bottle service. But it's interesting. I finally relented and put this on. I started serving punch by the glass, like almost made like a cocktail, at my last bar in Chicago Prairie School. And I've done that at my current restaurant, Takibi, and it sells well. Like going back to like entrepreneur, making mistakes and learning, I can't seem to quite make the bowl come back, but I have found great success in making individual portions of punch.
Yes, maybe COVID had something to do with not having a big bowl of something in front of you that everyone's dipping into, but definitely,
Exactly.
definitely the single ones. Now you have these two wonderful liquids. Are you thinking of doing something else at Banks?
The interesting thing is, when Banks was acquired by Bacardi nearly 8 years, I think it's around 8 years ago, 9 years ago now, my initial instinct, we were acquired at a time when we had done a number of line extensions, some of which I thought were smart and some of which I wasn't involved in at all. And my initial instinct at this time was that we would start working on some line extensions that I wanted to work on. And I have worked on a couple of them, sadly, that haven't come to market. But I have to say, now that I look back all these years and I look at some of, I won't call them competitors, but I look at other friends in the business who have been able to like launch all the line extensions that they wanted, that it's actually kind of nice to have, almost like if you've ever been to McSorley's in the East Village, when you go to McSorley's and you go to the bar, if you order a beer, they give you 2 beers instead of 1 beer. They're like in these little awesome heavy glasses, and you have 2 options. You have light or dark, and that's all you can drink. I don't think you can even order whiskey. You can just drink one of 2 beers, and it's the oldest bar in New York City, and it's amazing. And while we have a long way to go to get to McSorley's age, I'm kind of liking me and my 2 rums right now. Like it's nice to have one of 2 options. I can put them both in my bag. I can stock them both in my bar. They're workhorse rums that work great in all the drinks, in 90% of the drinks that aren't dark rum or spiced rum or agricole rum that I need to mix in my bar. And so the answer is yes. Like, would I like to work on other rums with Bacardi? Sure. But am I glad that I don't have 172 rums done with a million other collaborators right now, and that it takes me all hour just to go through each formula? Yeah, it's nice to just have 2 rums in some ways. I feel like we're focused. And going back to that idea we were talking about earlier, having a plan and being focused is something that is important in business and life. And I feel like the other thing I'll say is that having had the great fortune of working on like a prototypical discovery brand like PDT, which didn't have a website or use social media during my time there, or even have a sign outside, it takes people a lot longer than you think to discover what you're doing. And so sometimes if you're constantly innovating, by the time people discover you, you're like way, you have no relationship to what they just discovered. So, and sometimes you've got to, in the same way that like the drink like a penicillin has stood the test of time. Why? Because Sam Ross keeps making it and he's still running bars. And I think that in the same sense, it's nice that I have slowed down, or I haven't slowed down, but my Bacardi slowed down with Banks. And we're really allowed to sort of just focus on these two because they're special.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. Two things came to mind. Number one, I always think that every television show becomes popular in its third season. If it lasts, all of a sudden everyone discovers it, from Seinfeld to Succession. Everyone somehow discovers it its third season. So it needs to baste a little. And as a bartender, having only two liquids to play with or should I say, having two liquids to play with is plenty, because there are thousands, tens and tens of thousands of cocktails that you can create. And if you have 10 rums that you're dealing with, it gets probably a little too crazy. And so you have these wonderful liquids that you can just keep playing with. So, you'll be having millions of cocktails with these two.
Yeah, I think that I look back on it now and I'm grateful. And I think that it's allowed people time to catch up. And I think the rum category has catched up. Like in 10 years, the rum category is premiumized, and we're moving towards drier rums being standard. We're moving towards sipping rums not being an oxymoron. We're moving in all the directions that I had hoped for 10 years ago. And while, it's been a rising tide lifts all the ships, a lot of different brands have seen what we've done, and some of them have used, part of our playbook. And I look back on it and I'm proud of what Banks has helped, to be a part of. And I still think they remain. I go to bars now and everyone has their own house rum blend, and I sort of laugh at them, just like, yeah, like Banks, like it's sort of
2008 was early.
Yeah,
2008 was early. And you guys,
I feel like it's. I'm proud of what we accomplished. Will it ever become a million case brand? Not looking like it right now, but it's. I feel like it's. Every sort of product needs every product needs its own Ryan Reynolds, really. But we're right now in the midst of this kind of like celebrity spirit thing, which unfortunately I'm not The Rock, but even though I do have this haircut, but I feel like Banks just needs a break or two. It needs a cameo in a Batman movie and something else, and who knows what'll happen. Like, I think it's a great spirit. I continue to enjoy mixing with it year to year, and I feel like, like myself in my own career, right place, right time, and sort of like doing the right thing. And I think that we'll get there.
I think that leads perfectly into the top tip for the home bartender. So if someone is discovering Banks, and what would your tip be for them to do first with it? For both,
I feel like I would say
the light and the golden.
Yeah, I mean, going back to my Pepsi challenge when I first tasted it myself, I like to taste something on its own, just try it on its own. And then if I like it, I like to taste it next to the benchmarks that I sort of like think of as the best in the bar. And so like what I would say is, like, everyone who is interested in rums, taste it at a bar, and then if you get a bottle at home, taste it next to the rum that you think is the best. And I think that gives you a sense of calibration as far as like where you think it fits. And then the other thing I would say is that I always think of spirits as in a utilitarian sense. Like, is this my sipping spirit? Is this my daiquiri spirit? Is this my old fashioned spirit? So I think with white rum, you may be a tropical tiki person, or you may be a daiquiri person, or you may be a cigar and rum person. Think of like the track that you're on, and then think of the drinks or the application like on the rocks or neat or in a long drink that you typically have it, and give it a try. Because I think that there's sort of two buckets. There's like on its own, which is more for educational purpose, unless you're like a neat spirit drinker. And then two, in an application like a recipe. And there's obviously tons of recipes out there on the internet. We have Banks as many as the internet does. But those would be my two recommendations. Try it on its own first, and then plug it into an application that works for you and see how it does.
Well, I have one of your punch recipes, so they can try it on that too.
There you go.
There you go. Now, I always ask this to everyone who's on my show, but if you could be anywhere drinking anything right now, where would that be and what would you be drinking?
So I've answered this question before, and the answer remains the same. When I was younger and more, when I was the hot new thing in the bar world and was jet setting all over to give talks and visit distilleries and do pop-ups and whatnot, I had the opportunity to just have some amazing experiences that I'll never forget and never not continue to cherish. But I realized that with all this great fortune, that the answer to that question could get real obnoxious very quickly. Like, I just saw a friend who was guest chefing at the Park Hyatt in Tokyo. And like, I spent 2 weeks doing the same thing there a long time ago and loved it. And I feel like instead of being that guy who's like, oh, my favorite, place to drink is like Toki, drinking like whiskey at the Park Hyatt in Tokyo, like Bill Murray or whatever, I thought about how so much of being both the sort of person that you would want to drink with and being not obnoxious is being able to be present. And I feel like we've all been out for a drink with that person who's like on their phone all the time, or who has like, they're waiting. You can almost tell that they would rather be drinking somewhere else with someone else, or they have something better to do. And so my answer to this question, which I hope is inspirational to some of your viewers, is like to be present. And whether it's like being present over a whiskey at the Park Hyatt Tokyo, or being present over a beer at the local tavern with your coworker, that irregardless of the setting, the person or people you're with, or the beverage you're with, to really enjoy it and be present in the place with the people with that drink, because it's really sort of like that act of being present and with people when you're in bars or when you're at home drinking with someone else really defines whether you're fun to drink with and whether you're the sort of person that other people want to be out with. So I would say that, like I always say, tritely, that my favorite drink is the one in front of me with the people I'm with. So that's my morning Chinese herbs with you here at 10 a.m. On the show. Because I feel like being, got to be present. You got to be here and now.
I love that. That's one of my favorite answers of all time. Very good. Which doesn't surprise me from the man who's written the book and created the rums. So listen, this has been such a joy for me. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me and talking me through your life and what you've done and what you've achieved. It's really been a treat.
Pleasure's all mine.